I have decided this summer will be the summer of Austen. Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to another video, a very exciting video, a first in a series, if you will. I have a very important goal this summer, and that goal is to read every book that Jane Austen wrote. I am so very excited. Last summer, I decided to read War and Peace, and it was truly a life-changing experience. I love the idea of reading more classics, and this summer I decided to start with the GOAT, if you will, the greatest of all time, in so many people's opinions. I don't know yet, because I've only ever read one of her books and I was in high school, so we shall see. I went to a used bookstore and I bought all of the Jane Austen and kind of felt a little bit like a maniac, but whatever. I'm sure they didn't mind. So this is it. This is the beginning. I took all of the books that I had on my shelf, I totaled all of the page numbers, and then I divided it by the number of days between now and September 1st. And it got me to about 22 pages a day. That's how much I would have to read. So who knows, maybe I'll finish earlier, maybe I will finish later. I do not want this to be about, you know, the number of pages or making sure I reach a deadline. It's more about savoring the great writing that is from Jane Austen. I decided first and foremost to start with the obvious choice, and that is Pride and Prejudice. But not just any Pride, not just any Pride and Prejudice. But I'm not just reading Pride and Prejudice. I am reading the annotated Pride and Prejudice, and oh boy, I was really going back and forth between reading, like just reading Pride and Prejudice or reading this. But as I said, I read Pride and Prejudice in high school. Now, high school Megan was a bit of a snob, and that's kind of weird to say because it's Jane Austen, but I was super into like the Beats and like Allen Ginsberg. And so I feel like I wasn't in the right frame of mind to read Jane Austen. However, I know I'm in the right frame of mind now, and I figured that starting with an annotated book would be really interesting because it would provide a lot of context for her writing choices and the way that she approaches plot and characters. And I was not wrong. This is an incredibly thick book. It is laid out with the story on one side and a bunch of notes on the other side. I basically read the page and then I read all of the annotations, and some are really great and insightful, some are kind of obvious, but I'm really enjoying it. The one thing I will say is it does lose a little bit of the flow that Austen is so good at creating and the humor that she's so good at creating. It's kind of like watching a DVD with the commentary on. You're not really getting the plot, you're just kind of getting the facts. But of course I know the plot of Pride and Prejudice, and I love the plot of Pride and Prejudice, and I love the characters. I woke up super early this morning and I went to the park and I watched the sunrise, and there's nothing like reading Jane Austen in the early summer morning while the birds are singing and the sun is coming up. It was so good. It's basically the vibe I want for my entire summer. There were also some photos of fancy bonnets, because apparently decorating hats was a big thing back then. I think where Jane Austen shines is her characters and her realism, and within the first 3 chapters of Pride and Prejudice you get it right away. So I'm very much looking forward to continuing on and reading the annotations as well as experiencing Pride and Prejudice. with as little sound as possible outside. There are so many historical notes. Okay, let's just give you a little bit of an update to see where I am. So I have currently read up to chapter 10, so I'm on page 88 of this edition. And overall thoughts. Look, I love a floppy book, but this is a pretty intense version. I love the story. I love the story so very much. It is so fun, and right off the bat, you just kind of get sucked into it. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I feel like I might finish this beforehand. If I'm being honest, some of the annotations don't feel necessary. They feel a little bit obvious. Sometimes they define a word and you're like, yeah, I knew what that word meant, but like, appreciate you telling me that. And so I feel like they almost were forced to create more notes than necessary in order to work into this kind of format. I feel like these could have been footnotes and there could have been way less. That being said, there are some really interesting insights to both the way Jane Austen thought. There's some interesting notes about comparing various moments to other scenes in other books, and it gives you a little bit of insight into her social commentary. And, you know, there are a lot of cool pictures of like things from that time period, but I don't know that it's necessary to read this version. Right off the bat, this book is hilarious. I think that Jane Austen doesn't necessarily, I'm not going to say she doesn't get enough credit, but I just think that people don't expect her books to be as funny as they are, especially if you haven't read them. But this book right off the bat is hilarious. You know, we start with this scene between Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet, and Mr. Bennet is just kind of mocking his wife in a hilarious way of not taking her very seriously, and it feels authentic to a marriage where one person is slightly crazier than the other, and it just, you know, it's really delightful. Of course, we start off with the most famous line: "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife." Great. We immediately know what this book is about. We immediately know what to expect the plot to be, and we immediately get insight into all of the characters' motivations. And much like the characters themselves, that gets flipped on its head, and it gets subverted, I should say. And it is kind of not what the book becomes about. It becomes about misunderstanding and putting away preconceived notions of how someone or something should be. Right off the bat, brilliant. I feel like I would probably be Mr. Bennet in this story. You know, just kind of like aloof to the point, I would say aloof about societal expectations and the way you should act, to the point of it being detrimental to yourself. You know, Mr. Bennet is such a great kind of relatable voice, but one of the things that was interesting in the annotation is they talk about how this is actually quite detrimental, that he doesn't really care about getting his children married off, or his daughters, I should say, married off, because if they don't get married, then when he dies, they get nothing, and that's actually very serious. Really quickly, I decided to start annotating it because I just feel like I have so many feelings and so many thoughts. But I always keep my annotations quite simple. I really love to read books for the writing, so often when I annotate, I'm actually just highlighting passages that like make my heart soar and that are beautiful writing. I find with Jane Austen though, her characters and her kind of social commentary are so poignant that I wanted to be able to separate between the two. So I actually am following a color coordinated system. I don't know if I will continue that, but it's very, very simple. Character insights. So whenever we see I'm trying not to use the word insight, but I'm just going to. But whenever we get a little bit of insight into a person's true character, I will highlight that in pink, but I also will highlight just kind of any advancement in character development with any of the characters in pink. So basically anything to do with characterization is pink. Yellow is the foreshadowing / misunderstanding elements of this book. There are so many misunderstandings in this book, and there's so many instances of Austen foreshadowing the fact that misunderstanding will happen, that it's just really fun to kind of catch them all. Not that I've been able to catch them all, but to try to catch them all. Kind of like Pokemon. Pokemon and Jane Austen. Very similar. I've never played Pokemon. I don't know why I just referenced Pokemon, but whatever. And then blue is just kind of like history / societal commentary. So whenever I learn something interesting about the way society worked, or whenever it's very obvious that Jane Austen is using social commentary here, or commentating on societal norms. So intelligent when I use the same words to describe things. Very briefly, I wanted to talk about the two pairs, the two couples, the main characters, as it were, starting off with Jane and Mr. Bingley. I did not expect to fall in love with Mr. Bingley in this book, but I truly love him. I would die for him. I think that he is just so wonderful, and I thought I loved Mr. Darcy, but now I don't know. Now my heart belongs to both of them, because he is so sweet. And one thing that I found really interesting going into this book is that you see the way that Jane and Mr. Bingley and Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy are mirrors of one another. With Jane and Mr. Bingley, it's almost obvious right away that they are incredibly kind, good souls, and they wear their hearts on their sleeves. And with Mr. Bingley, in so many ways, that will be used against him, and it's almost to the point of him being naive. I love that kind of character. I think having a truly good character is a very interesting thing, because especially within this book, you can kind of see how it's used against both of them, and how they are very much a product of other people's prejudice within them. And equally, I find it interesting how Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy are also very mirrored, and there is the hints of their ability to understand each other in a way that not everyone is understanding them. And what I mean by that is, I especially loved the scene when Elizabeth is visiting the Bingley household because Jane is ill, and she goes downstairs after tending to her sister, and she sees that they're gambling, they're playing cards, and she decides not to do that, and instead she decides to read. And Mrs. Bingley, the evil Mrs. Bingley, really don't like that character, decides to kind of undercut her in like a very classic way of like being polite but actually not being polite. And she says, you know, you're a big reader, which, you know, such an insult back in the day. How dare women be educated? Because again, the social insight to that is so interesting, because women were expected to be educated but not too educated. We were expected to read, but don't read too much. There was just all these demands. So she tries to subtly undercut Elizabeth. And then later on, when Mr. Darcy and Miss Bingley are listing all of the attributes that women must possess, Miss Bingley says, you know, a woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the word, and besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved. And then Mr. Darcy adds, all this she must possess, added Darcy, and to all this she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. And again, it's so interesting because you can read this scene and you can read Mr. Darcy as being like, oh, wow, you've got a lot of expectations for a woman. That's kind of gross. But what's really happening is he's subtly undercutting Miss Bingley and complimenting Elizabeth. And I remember one of my friends actually watched the Pride and Prejudice movie and was like, I really don't understand what people see in Mr. Darcy. He's kind of an a-hole. And the truth is, in so many ways he is, but in so many ways he is a secret cinnamon roll. And I love that about him. to grab a coffee. I haven't had a Starbucks in so long, like months and months, pretty much since I moved, because the area that we moved to has amazing coffee places, like family run coffee places that just serve like the best coffee. And there is like a Starbucks across the street from us, but it just feels weird to like go to Starbucks when there's like amazing coffee, and actually like it's less expensive. So I haven't had a Starbucks in a really long time, but anyway, this is a long-winded way of saying this is my first Starbucks, and I got the vanilla oat, the iced toasted vanilla oat shaken espresso, I think is what it is. Wow, that's a lot of words. So I'm gonna try it and we'll see. Look, it's not bad, but it is like 7:30 in the morning, and this is a lot of sugar. It's not bad though. It's really sweet. Yeah, I don't know. Anywho, I'm gonna read now. Angle, but it's because you're sitting on my shoes. I'm just reading the dancing scene and I love it so much. This is such a masterclass in character development and revelations through conversation, and I just love the journey that Mr. Darcy goes on in this book. And not so much his journey, I mean, yes, he goes on a journey, but it's more the subtle revelations of his character and his introversion that are revealed. So during the dance, Elizabeth is trying to converse with him, and she's saying, you know, I commented on this, you should comment on this now. You know, we normally talk when people dance. Like, she's just like hating him so much at this point. And so after she says, you know, I said this, you should comment on this, Mr. Darcy says, do you talk by rule then while you are dancing? And Elizabeth replies, sometimes one must speak a little, you know. It would look odd to be entirely silent for half an hour together. And yet, for the advantage of some, conversation ought to be so arranged as that they may have the trouble of saying as little as possible. And then Mr. Darcy says, are you consulting your own feelings in the present case, or do you imagine that you are gratifying mine? And again, I just love how this scene can be taken so many ways, and there's so much to pick apart in these tiny little lines of dialogue. Going back to what I was saying before about how they truly understand each other and they don't even realize it. And that, I think, is why this is such a beautiful, beautiful romance. Elizabeth is so determined to hate Mr. Darcy at this moment, yet she's doing exactly what he needs in this moment, which is she is running the conversation, and she is telling him she's telling him what to say. And as a severe introvert, I'm sure he somewhat appreciates that, because I feel like most introverts very much want there to be rules when it comes to conversing with people they are not comfortable with. I love it. It's so good. Mr. Darcy, you're such a cinnamon roll. I also just think it's so interesting to have a male lead who is shy. I think Mr. Darcy is incredibly shy, and I just really like that characteristic. I think that it's so different than what you normally see. And his shyness is also pride, but it also is, he just is like trying to figure it out. He has no idea. He likes a lady. So good. I have to say that I really think Mr. Collins is hilarious, and all I can picture is the actor who played him in the 2005 movie. He's so perfect, and he's so hilarious on the page. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Hey, hi, hello. Just checking in. I just finished the proposal scene, the first proposal scene, and the letter that follows it, that Mr. Darcy writes to Elizabeth. First of all, I am on page 398. I'm on chapter 13. I am just over halfway. I have to say that, like, this is such a good floppy book to read. Okay, so my general thoughts so far. Let's see if I can be intelligent right now. Okay. First, I'm still loving it. I don't know if I love, not that, okay, let's say this. I don't know if Jane Austen's writing is necessarily for me. I like a little bit more floweriness to my prose. And Austen is very frank. She's very matter of fact. Her characters are incredibly realistic. Her circumstances are equally so. And she was one of the first writers to write about the real world in the novel form. So that makes sense to me, and that is one of the reasons why she's regarded as one of the greatest writers. It's not the only reason. I mean, she writes incredible books, and I am liking this book a lot, but I don't know if I'm necessarily loving the writing. I'm learning quite a bit about society at this time and societal rules. And I felt like I got a little bit of that from like previously reading this as well as watching the movie. But something like within these annotations, which I thought was really interesting, is when Mr. Darcy gives Elizabeth the letter, one of the annotations says, "It was improper for a man to correspond with an unmarried woman unless he was engaged to her or they had a family connection. Hence, Darcy cannot send a letter to Elizabeth and must deliver it by hand. Even then, the letter borders on impropriety, though it could be justified in this case by the importance of the communication." So you couldn't send a letter by mail, but you could deliver it by hand. Little things like that, man. That the instances leading up to the proposal, probably about like the 2 chapters leading up to the proposal, I was quite bored. I don't love the Lady Catherine, Mr. Collins scenes. I think that they are fine, but they're not as amusing as I think I originally found Mr. Collins. I found Lady Catherine to be a jerk, and I think I was just like reading being like, can this lady just go away? Can she just go away now? But it was really important because that also is one of the moments where that is the moment where Elizabeth realizes what Mr. Darcy has done to her sister, and you need that in order to have the proposal be rejected so strongly. What a scene. I feel like the proposal was probably my favorite scene in the whole book. I love the way Mr. Darcy proposes. I think that the way he proposes is exactly how you would expect him to propose, and it perfectly displays how he is ruled by pride. He's kind of a jerk at this point. I mean, he clearly loves her, but you're like, okay, you love her despite all of these flaws that you list, and all of these like external circumstances that she can't really help. And you're like, yeah, but I love you anyway. So really, like, his only redeeming factor up until this point is that he loves her. After Elizabeth rejects him quite intensely initially, he is talking about how perhaps if he had been kinder in his proposal, she would have said yes. But he couldn't have done that because he is so honest, and he's driven by honesty, and how that is, you know, a part of his character. And he says the line, which I love this line. This is one of my favorite lines in the book, and it's, "Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your connections?" I love that that's in a proposal. And I love the way it's delivered in the movie. Again, I'm really sorry to always talk about the movie, but like, I just think that those two actors, Keira Knightley and whatever his name is, because I keep forgetting what his name is, just played these parts so perfectly. It was essentially just a trait of the times that he really is like bestowing a favor on Elizabeth for marrying her, and how he just assumed she would accept it. Again, being governed by pride. The height of both of their issues. His pride and her misunderstanding of his actions, and her, not misunderstanding, but her unwillingness to relent in her hatred of him. Her prejudice, if you will. We're seeing the unraveling of everything, at least for me, that I've thought about Mr. Darcy up until this point. You know, I thought he was a jerk. I thought he was like haughty, and in so many ways he is, but I think that this is like gonna be his lesson, and this is where the turning point of him being like, oh shit, I should probably like check myself a little bit. And honestly, like I can't like not talk about the last thing that Elizabeth Bennet says to him, because it is one of the greatest lines ever. From the very beginning, from the first moment, I may almost say, of my acquaintance with you, your manners impressing me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others, were such as to form that groundwork of disapprobation on which succeeding events have built so immovable a dislike. And had I not known you a month before, I felt you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed to marry. Damn, Elizabeth! This begins the unraveling of Mr. Darcy's character, where he confesses in a letter the truth behind his relationship with Mr. Wickham. Mr. Darcy essentially confesses that Wickham tried to marry his sister for money, essentially wooed his super young sister for money, and is a trash bag of a human being, and he is. His revelation of that is incredibly vulnerable, because when you think of Mr. Darcy as being ruled by pride, admitting something like this, admitting a huge shame, admitting something that would be a huge shame on his family if it ever got out, it would destroy his sister's reputation, is really something that I don't think Mr. Darcy would easily do to anybody else. So I really like it. I hope that I continue to fall for Mr. Darcy. Onward. Everyone just needs to like talk it out, you know? I just powered through and I finished. Oh my gosh. Okay, so first I have to say that the second half flew by. I finished probably like 300 pages in like 2 days. I just couldn't put it down. Essentially actually pretty much since my last update, I just like have not been able to stop reading it. How to summarize how I feel about this book. Pardon me, my eyes are very sore. I just need a little bit of tea from my snail mug. I've decided to name him Herman. Anyway, on to what we're actually talking about. I just finished. Woo. Nothing is more satisfying than a book full of tabs. There are a number of colors, mainly because I ran out of tabs. Wow. Okay. Thoughts. Brain dead thoughts. Since Darcy proposed, and really just the second half of the novel, the plot really picked up. Which, from everything I know about Jane Austen, I actually don't know the plots of her other books as well. But from everything I know, that's kind of the structure of her novels. There's a lot of setup and then action, which you can kind of see in the colors of the tabs. It starts off with like a lot of misunderstanding and characterization, and then there's a lot of purple, which turns into like the revelations. Anyway, it was so good. I feel like reading a Jane Austen novel is incredibly singular of an experience. Her ability to present characters and bring them on a journey is so much fun to consume. You know, the journey that Elizabeth goes on is almost in so many ways a masterclass of character evolution, and the ways that Austen both presents it within the plot, but also subtly shows the transformation towards the end is so good. It is so much fun to watch flawed characters come to terms with their flaws and then make themselves better. One of the things that you saw me reacting to was Elizabeth pressing Mr. Darcy on when he fell in love with her, and he says, "I was in the middle before I knew I had begun." I love it. I love how Jane Austen balances this practicality in love, but also romantic love so very well. You know, the ultimate idea of this novel is that marriage should make you better, and the person that you partner with should make you better. And in so many ways, as I was saying at the very beginning, the way that Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy complement each other and Jane and Mr. Bingley complement each other, it's so interesting now seeing the contrast between the two characters and their relationships. Honestly, this book was just such a delight. It was a delight from start to finish. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed a character-driven drama. How pristine Jane Austen is when writing characters and their development and the journeys that they go on towards self-discovery and repentance in some way is so much fun to watch. I think I fell in love with Mr. Darcy even more. I love the 2005 adaptation even more now that I've read the book. I think that it did a splendid job. I think that Mr. Darcy is the ultimate introvert. One of the things that was so interesting was meeting his sister and the characterization of his sister as being acutely shy and not being able to speak. I thought that it was really interesting because it made me feel like, yeah, Mr. Darcy is just as shy. I just loved it because I felt like it solidified that characterization even more. He's shy. He's such an introvert. He's so awkward, and sometimes awkward people say really, really harsh things and they don't mean it. People do that all the time, actually. You don't have to be introverted to have that happen. One of the annotations in the book when we meet Miss Darcy is Mr. Darcy's younger sister. who was bewitched and thrown away by Mr. Wickham, the evil Mr. Wickham. And she's incredibly shy, and the annotation says that Miss Darcy's extreme shyness has given rise to speculation that shyness is also the explanation for Darcy's reserved and haughty air. It's true that Darcy is uncomfortable and less friendly in the presence of strangers, and that does account for some of his behavior, but he never exhibits any difficulty in speaking out, often forcefully when he wishes. He certainly does not display the absolute inability to speak, even when surrounded by friendly people that his sister does. And yeah, I loved the insight even more into Mr. Darcy's character when we meet his sister. I think it just even furthers this journey of misunderstanding to understanding. And oh my goodness, was there ever so much misunderstanding. But it was also really refreshing having like it all out in the open at the end. The two characters just hashing it out and like telling each other how they felt. Delightful. I'm delirious. Onward. Heading on to our next one in this journey of reading all of Jane Austen. I realize now that I should have actually read them in order of publication. I wasn't thinking. I was just really excited to read Pride Prejudice. So I'm going to pick up Sense and Sensibility next. I know nothing about the rest of her novels. Zip. I haven't seen any movies, and I'm not going to until I've watched the books, because truthfully, often when I watch the movie, I like it more and like fall in love with it. Although that didn't really happen here. I think that this was a really, I'm going to say something controversial, but I think it was a good supplement to the movie, which is ridiculous because it's the original text. I experienced the movie a lot more than I have the book, so I will always go back to the movie. I don't know if I'll ever go back to this book. And it's going to be so wonderful to experience even more delightful characters and storylines and see the journeys that they go on, all in the cozy comfort of a Jane Austen book. My eyes are bleeding.